The next speaker on the list, which is Sal Nuzzo. Sal is the Vice President of Policy and the Director of the Center for Economic Prosperity at the James Madison Institute. He is, I love looking at some of the personal statements on there, on these bios, and I just have to kind of needle him a little bit about movie quotes. Is anybody he is listed on there as being an expert on movie quotes from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. He's thrown down the gauntlet, and anybody who wants to challenge him, I invite them to go ahead and do so. Sal, you can sit or stand. All right. Well, Sal, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. And personally, I would like to first state my disappointment with Lindsay Boyd. I think she needs to seriously reevaluate her priorities in life. But with that being said, I will do my best to tell you a little bit about the Florida story.
Well, please go ahead.
Well, one of the things I'm glad that you didn't needle me about one of the most alarming elements of my bio, and that is prior to coming to the James Madison Institute, I was the director of research at the Florida Chamber of Commerce Foundation. So spent a few years in the trenches on the research side with quite possibly and understandably one of the single largest business advocacy organizations at the state level in the U.S. And they've been incredibly successful in their legislative priorities. But as a free market absolutist for the most part, I have found a much better home over the last several years with JMI. I direct the policy operations for the Institute, and I have the privilege of having been able to work with a good number of the folks that have spoken here, that have been in the healthcare trenches, and I can assure you they know a heck of a lot more than me. But as the Florida kind of representative for this, our story, we're hoping, like Becky had said, we're hoping that our story can help build momentum for a lot of these other states. We kind of recognize in Florida that this is a policy challenge, a policy problem, but it involves a political solution. And so in Florida, if you're not familiar with our state, there are Republicans everywhere. There is only one statewide elected Democrat. That is Bill Nelson, who's a U.S. Senator, who will go through a pretty nasty reelection campaign next year, most likely against the term-limited governor of Florida, Rick Scott. And if you're not familiar with Rick Scott, governor of Florida, reelected in 2016, or 2014, rather, I'm sorry, was the former president of the Hospital Corporation of America. So we have a little bit of background among our elected officials. With that in mind, con repeal has been a near impossibility in Florida, and that is one of the political realities we have had to face, and we kind of figured out why market-based healthcare reforms were going to be a challenge in Florida back in 2014 and 2015 when we underwent the battle over Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act. And you don't need to quote me. You can quote one of the investigative journalists among the Florida press corps who discovered that I want to say of Florida's 40 state senators, I think it was either 12 or 13 were either directly employed by a hospital or were married to a direct employee of a hospital. And we're not talking about they weren't a doctor. They were the senior VP of legislative affairs. They were the director of government affairs. So anything involving policy issues that were going to impact the bottom lines of hospitals was going to be a big challenge. Now, in Florida, we were able to beat back Medicaid reform. What we have been able to find is that they have been able to beat back con reform. So we have engaged in some small skirmishes, and I call them that because the most relevant example of what it's like in Florida with respect to con occurred in 2016 in the legislative session. So the president of the Florida Senate, a man by the name of Don Gates, who is a former board member of the James Madison Institute, put forward a modest reform proposal for Khan. We won't call it a repeal because it didn't repeal anything. It wasn't really even much of a reform. What it did was it asked for, in legislation, a process for an exemption to the Khan in one of our Khans, nursing homes. And it asked for the exemption uh, if the proposed facility would satisfy a number of conditions. And one of those conditions was it would provide dollar for dollar charity care for every single dollar that it was getting for paying customers. And while we thought this was probably the single smallest step you could take in the road to con reform, it was heard in one committee in the Senate, the Senate Health Policy Committee, subcommittee, which was 5-3. Or I'm sorry, it had 9 members of the subcommittee. One member was not there. It's controlled by Republicans, and it went down 5-3. The vote was known beforehand. I went as a courtesy to President Gates at the time, who had asked us to kind of stand with him. And there were roughly 20, somewhere between 25 and 30, when it got to public comments, 25 and 30 individuals who stood up to testify. 2 of them testified in opposition or in favor of this exemption. It was us and AFP. And the rest of everybody stood up in opposition and made every single argument you have heard from everyone around about the fact that even this modest proposal would kill off old people and do all kinds of damage in the state of Florida, and it went down. And for the most part, what we kind of found out was they really only even agended this bill as a courtesy to the sitting Senate president. They wouldn't even vote for him in the first subcommittee. So where Becky's challenge is more on the House side, in Florida, our challenge is on the Senate. We have 120 state legislators on the House side. We have a Senate of 40 members. That brings us to kind of what we encountered in between 2016 and into 2017. We had the pleasure of hosting at our annual policy summit a roundtable that we brought together as many partners from around the country as we could. So we had folks from AFP, from IJ, from Pacific Legal. Lee was invited, although you were like in surgery or so. You were doing something then, which again, you need to reevaluate your priorities. We had folks from ALEC come. We had SPN. SPN brought in a communications consultant, and we sat around and tried to figure out the best mechanism for moving forward. And what we came to the acknowledgement of our great state AFP chapter president, Chris Hudson, was that without a certain level of victory in the state Senate and the primaries, we were going to falter in 2017. So we had to prepare for a multi-year approach to this. And so we went in with kind of open eyes. We knew where we were going to fall in line. And as we expected, we didn't get enough victories in the state Senate to have any kind of hope of advancing a real full-fledged reform effort in 2017. But we did get a very solid group of freshmen. We are term limited in Florida. We had one of our biggest freshman classes in Florida's history, 27 freshmen, almost all of them very strong free market conservatives. And we were able to work with a tremendous legislator by the name of Alex Miller. She's a freshman legislator out of the Sarasota area, owns a healthcare technology or a healthcare related company, knew enough about the industry to be willing to kind of take on the battle and knew the direction that it needed to go. We were able to partner with the Mercatus Center in issuing a policy brief in the run-up to the Florida legislative session. It was called, we kind of took our play was, we called it the biggest healthcare con. So if you're interested, it's at jamesmadison.org. And as one of my counterparts, I think it's from Oklahoma, Jonathan says, we are only one 20-page white paper from complete and total victory. And that's kind of an acknowledgement of the thick, dense white papers full of the data and the facts. They need something more to them. And that kind of brought me to what Lee was starting on, and that's the story of Sarasota and Northport, actually. In 2003, and we kind of uncovered this in the context of our research, and we worked with Lee to kind of unpack this story, and we led the policy brief out with this story, and we used it in testimony, we used it in op-eds, we used it everywhere we could to try and drive the point home. So in 2003, the city of Northport was one of the fastest growing cities in Florida. Small area, did not have a hospital, kind of southwest Florida, a little south and east of Sarasota, which is also a big area. They have, I believe it was at the time, 2 hospitals, right? Or was it just 1? 2. And so Northport wanted to put in place and build a small residential bed hospital for themselves. They spent, I believe it was roughly $150,000 on the certificate of need application process. They hired a consultant. They submitted their application to the Agency for Healthcare Administration, to ACA, with, I believe it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 22,000 letters of support. ACA approved the certificate of need application. It gets challenged, of course. It goes before an administrative law judge, and it was rejected. The reasoning, though, is peculiar. The reasoning for the administrative law judge rejecting the certificate of need was it was claimed that the population projections that Northport was using to justify the need for a new hospital were wildly overestimated. It was just not going to grow that far. It plateaued, yada, yada. Fast forward, I think it was 10 years. No, the population projections were not overestimated. The population projections were underestimated. Northport passed Sarasota in population. It continues to boom. And now individuals who are in Sarasota are having challenges getting even to regular specialists because, as we know, specialists like to, get near existing hospitals. And so we brought out this and we led the policy brief with, here is your real life example of why con laws are restricting access to care. And here's why even the process for refusing them is wildly jaded and needs to be reformed. So Representative Miller took this to heart. She's from that area. She championed the cause. And she worked tirelessly and got a reform bill through the House of Representatives. It was voted on. It was approved. It was approved bipartisanly. And so we kind of caught that as our lightning in a bottle for 2017 big win. However, it started, and this is the kind of the lesson we learned in the process, the sausage making, so to speak, is start out big. And here's why. As it moves from subcommittee to committee to House floor, at every single stop, you will face entrenched interests from every single little caveat or every single little cadre of the healthcare establishment. And what happened was that Representative Miller would present her bill. She would speak passionately about it, and then one by one, the Florida Healthcare Association, which represents all of the nursing homes, the Florida Osteopathic, the Florida this, the Florida that, would get up and say, yes, indeed, we support reforming the certificate of need process in Florida. However, we'd like to explain why our little segment of the healthcare industry should be exempted from that reform. And so it got what we call in Florida, the bill got loved to death. So we were able to fend off most of the challenges, but the 2 biggest in Florida that we saw that we really need to get out of, but they managed to get their exemptions in the final bill, were hospices and nursing homes. Now, it goes without saying, why would Florida need to expand nursing homes? Because we have one of the single largest elderly populations and growing in the United States. Florida's population between now and 2030 will expand roughly 6 million people 5 to 6 million people, depending on if you believe the which estimate from either the state or the University of Florida you believe. In both of those projections, however, 2/3 of that population growth alone is going to be over the age of 60. 2/3. The single biggest healthcare consumers, in terms of the cohort in Florida is going to be their population growing. So what we have thus seen. Oh, and I forgot to mention, Florida had for a period of, I believe it was 13 years, a moratorium on new nursing home construction. So what's happened is, yes, we may have a large number of nursing homes, but they were all built in the 60s and 70s. And when we look at states like Oklahoma and some of these other states that have done great things with new nursing home construction, where they have fiber optic capabilities, and you look at the technology present and how they're catering to what the elderly will need in 2020 versus what the elderly needed in 1970, you're seeing this widening care gap. And so those are some of the things that we're beginning to look at as we kind of move forward. I will hand it to the Florida Healthcare Association. In 2016, after we testified, they actually made a pilgrimage to our building and said, we'd like to talk with you because we'd like to come on board and support con reform, but we could never support con reform of nursing home facilities. And they had their data that they handed to me and say, here's why we feel this way, and we hope that you'll kind of you'll modify your policy position. And I told them, I said, I got to hand it to you. I have a lot of respect. You're kind of like the taxi cab company telling us why you'd support, why you want to, see Uber, reformed like taxis. But we just do not see eye to eye on this. And they are probably one of the bigger obstacles, along with kind of the Florida Hospital Association in terms of reform. So here's where we're going. We do have in place a media strategy. Although I did take note of Becky's website, we kind of want to do something like that in Florida to try and build more grassroots support. The two areas of focus, though, that we are going to kind of tack a little bit in the research that we do is we want to tie this to shortages and to jobs. If anyone has ever heard Florida Governor Rick Scott speak, in every sentence he has a noun, a verb, and the word jobs. That's how he articulates his vision. And just this morning, we got the email from the Department of Economic Opportunity, their monthly email. Florida created 22,000 jobs in the private sector alone. Our unemployment rate is 4.3%, and we have been moving in the right direction. So the way that we want to attack this is look at it from a jobs perspective. And the Florida governor, who is the prior president of the Hospital Corporation of America, has actually issued a statement in advance of the 2017 legislature saying con laws should be repealed. So we've got him on our side. We have the Florida House of Representatives on our side. The Senate still is our impediment to any kind of process. So lastly, the part about shortages. I mentioned about the population boom in Florida and how it's graying, pardon the pejorative. But one of the things that's not as well known is even just in something like primary care physicians, we are roughly 20 to 25,000 primary care physicians short of the need that we will have when that population boom comes as it proceeds along between now and 2030. So those are two of the things that we're looking to kind of dive into as we move forward to the 2018 legislative session, which will start actually in January as opposed to the normal March to May. So with that, I'll kind of...
Yeah, we're running a little bit late.
sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. So we need to get in two more talks before lunch, and we're running a little bit tight. But but that was great, Sal. We appreciate the update on Florida, and we will talk more about this. I think in the open session we can talk about strategy.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.